the Ukrainians who were fighting along with you with the apartheid. Now we say very often in the meetings of the Security Council, oh, Russia violates all possible provisions of the Charter, formulate that differently, to accept the fact Russian Federation acquired the seat illegally.
So, Mr. Ambassador, thank you for being here today. Let me begin by saying that you belong to this new class of Ukrainian diplomats who are not at all low-key or being afraid of, being blunt or provocative. And you were that even before the war, because I saw one of your interviews where you didn't mince words. And it seems to become the new norm, right? Because Ukraine's foreign minister, Kuleba, he was also quite vocal, and I'm sorry, quite vocal. And so is the ambassador, the departing ambassador to Germany, Andriy Melnik. Is that type of diplomacy now the new black worldwide, or is Ukraine acting as a trendsetter here?
Well, I think that that is the natural evolution of the Ukrainian society as a whole. And I think that this change of cultures is pretty much obvious. It was gradual. Let me remind you that Ukraine, at the moment of proclamation of independence, it was basically hardcore post-Soviet state with the apparatus and administration basically filled with the Soviet apparatchiks and Soviet diplomats. No disrespect to many wonderful people whom I met when I joined the Foreign Service in early 90s, and there were many seasoned, experienced diplomats, to name the few. Minister Udavenka, Minister Zlenka, Tarasuk, Agriska, and others. I mean, they were wonderful, and they still are wonderful, with the exception of those who unfortunately have already died. It would be very unrealistic to expect that in the early 90s we would have European style diplomacy. In fact, the whole Ministry of Foreign Affairs in early 90s, at the moment of proclamation of independence, was about 100 staff members, including drivers and security guards. Then the evolution brought us to multi-vector sort of diplomacy, and people were trying to sit on many chairs at the same time while speaking occasionally one thing in Brussels, another thing in Moscow, and third version somewhere else in Vienna. And I think that we finally departed from multi-vector way of diplomacy after the Revolution of Dignity, and the final nail in the coffin of multi-vector diplomacy was the military invasion, followed by full-scale aggression on the night of 23rd, 24th of February. I think that we all look at President Zelensky and others as leaders, national leaders. I think Kuleba is wonderful in terms of his creativity and his unconventional attitude to many things. So I think that is a natural trend. I think that I'm only part of this trend, and to tell you the truth, I quite enjoy it. I mean, I'm so sick and tired of ambiguities, and I'm so sick and tired of hypocrisy. And if hypocrisy is not longer a feature of Ukrainian diplomatic language, it is still very much present and pervasive, including in the United Nations and in other international fora.
But are others changing too? Because I mean, your style of diplomacy is quite, it's an interesting style, an aggressive one, a very honest one. Are others like acting the same way in the UN?
I think that when I came to New York in February 2020, and among the colleagues who were quite assertive and quite honest was the German permanent representative Christoph Heusgen. And you can Google many videos with him addressing the General Assembly or the Security Council, because Germany was part of the Security Council then. And you will see how honest he was and why the Russians hated him so much, because he would call a spade a spade. And I do really appreciate it, because, as I say, hypocrisy and indecisiveness is so pervasive. I can admit the need to be polite, but I cannot stand any longer latent lies that I have to hear practically every session of the Security Council from the Russian delegation.
I understand. These weeks have been busy for the UN due to the 77th General Assembly session and the sham referenda held by Russia in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. And we've seen and heard many powerful speeches by Joe Biden, Secretary Blinken, Charles Michel. But what is the sentiment like behind the scenes? Could you offer us a glimpse of that, especially when it comes to the countries that are, somewhat skeptical of Ukraine, not really our best friends?
Look, let me begin my answer from a different angle. You yourself and many others and we hear very often that the United Nations is a failure, that the United Nations is not functional, and that up to the extreme of some people suggesting that we must leave the United Nations, or that the United Nations should be cancelled. Let me offer you this reply. If you take a picture of the General Assembly, literally, if you take a picture of the General Assembly, that is a picture of the world as it is. And that is a picture that you cannot doctor or Photoshop. It would not be a true picture of the world. It's true that the General Assembly is not Europe. It's true that the General Assembly is not a transatlantic community. There's 193 countries. So to say that we do not like this photo and that photo can be shredded and we can turn our back to the world is not the way to deal with the world. I think it's a very primitive and populistic reply to what we see when we look at the world as a whole. Instead, we have to continue to work very hard with all the members of the General Assembly. We have to find the ways how to reach out and how to explain to them. There are hardcore thugs that I wouldn't really even spend time on trying to reach out, like, for example, North Korea or Syria. I mean, that's a lost case. I mean, there is no need to waste time on that. But there are also countries that belong in a group of nations that are ignorant. They're literally ignorant, believe it or not. I mean, it's not, there are many missions in this, in New York that only have like 2 staff members, an ambassador and a secretary, and that's it. Believe it or not, like 30% of the missions that are like that. But it's one thing that the United States has almost 200 staff members, and the Russian Federation has only diplomatic staff of Russia is 72, 75, I don't remember exactly, plus administrative staff. But there are literally countries that just have an ambassador and a secretary. And we have no embassies there for natural objective reasons. So that's by the way, the special feature of being ambassador, permanent representative in New York compared to many important capitals. where, with all my due regard, you just have one government to deal with, right? So you have just one foreign ministry to deal with. You just have a handful of interlocutors in the government who deal with foreign relations. Here in New York, just to meet all permanent representatives, almost 200, and observers, you need at least 1 year just to shake their hand once. So to reach out takes time. Therefore, it's very good that President Zelensky is now seem to appreciate the importance of addressing the United Nations. He spoke to the General Assembly in spite of all the difficulties that Russia tried to put to his address. He spoke several times to the Security Council. Minister Kuleba was here, Prime Minister Shmyhal was here, First Lady was here. They all had intensive programs, including with countries that are beyond our usual circle of friends, so from Europe and North America. On the other hand, we have also to acknowledge that the troubles that the world faces, the calamities, wars, are not only happening in Ukraine. People dying literally in Yemen every day, including of starvation. There are thousands and thousands of Yemeni children that were killed in Yemen as a result of the ongoing war there. There are global scale problems with energy supply, food supply, and it's the case that most of them were either created artificially or were escalated by the Russian aggression. And on the other hand, let's admit it, when we say that we are poor, according to the statistics, we are poor in the eyes of Brussels, right? But we are not poor in the eyes of Africans, Central Americans, Asians, who look at you and they say, you are coming from one of the richest parts, if not the richest parts of the world, white, European, so they see Ukraine from different kind of optics, and it may not be necessarily the way many people see from Europe or from Ukraine. So the world is very complex, and it takes a lot of effort to fight with Russian propaganda. Russians have embassies practically in every single African country. And if I say something or Kuleba says something, I can guarantee that the next day, if not the same day, a Russian ambassador calls the local foreign ministry and offer them vaccination from the Ukrainian version of events. African policy of the European Union has not been successful.
How come?
The US foreign policy has not been successful, and that's a matter of fact. And I'm speaking about the European Union, and I'm speaking about the United States, who have a very developed network of embassies and presence on the ground in Africa.
So how come it wasn't successful? I'm sorry, how come it wasn't successful?
It was not successful in terms of promotion of the policies and values and standards that we are in collective democratic world believe as prerequisites for the social and economic development, for many reasons. And I do not blame Africans by default, but I'm trying to offer you to look at that from their perspective. Many of them are post-colonial nations, practically all of them, right? So they have this post-colonial sentiment, and when they look at their ex-colonial powers, they are genetically suspicious of what is originating from certain capitals, European capitals. They also not ready from the point of view of their institutional capacity and strengths to absorb the standards that the United States or European Union put as a condition for receiving technical or financial assistance, because they do not, neither the United States nor European Union just give away money unconditionally like some other countries do. I would not name them, but you imagine who does offer money to third world countries with no conditions, but because they just want to be there in the field, filling the empty niches that are not filled by Europeans or by the Americans. And also, there is also this sentiment which is wrong, and which I try to fight with, and Kuleba does as well. Oftentimes you may hear here in New York that we support Russia because Russia was helping us to fight colonialism and apartheid, which is total nonsense. The Russian Federation was not a member of the United Nations until 1991. And let me tell you that in the 60s, 70s, 80s, it was the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic who was the member of the United Nations, and who, according to the division, non-public division of labor between the Soviet delegation and Belarusian delegation and the Ukrainian delegation, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was putting to a vote many anti-colonialism, anti-apartheid, if not resolutions, then amendments or proposals. So basically, of course, those were the Soviet, but still Ukrainian diplomats who were working very hard in the General Assembly to fight apartheid. And you can pull out many archive documents where you would see the name of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and probably even of Udavenko, who was the perm rep of Ukraine before the independence. So I try to remind those African countries that I'm sorry, guys, but it was the Ukrainians who were fighting along with you with the apartheid, But nevertheless, it's a matter of fact that they.
Well to that?
What's that?
Are they reacting well to that? Does it convince them?
They do react to that, and really, you have to remember that we became independent 30 plus years ago, right? And most of the current ambassadors, not only from Africa, but also from European countries, they were high school children then. I mean, they don't really remember. One of the fundamental problems of multilateral diplomacy, and especially here in New York, that people must have very deep institutional memory. Because if you do not remember what happened in New York 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and I will give you an example. You want to suggest something, right? You want to go to the General Assembly and you want to put a proposal. Let's do something, right? And if you haven't really looked into the archives, there is a very high chance that a Cuban delegation would come up and say, no, thank you very much. We have already considered that in 1963. So the problem is that many members of the young generation of diplomats, including well-educated Europeans, they do not have institutional memory. They don't remember what happened in the 60s or in the 70s, let alone in 1991. When I tell some of my colleagues how the permanent seat of the Soviet Union was transferred to the Russian Federation behind the closed doors, it's like an eye-opener to many. Because people simply either never read the full story or they never saw the original papers that led to that unfortunate development.
So you touched upon this fact that basically that seat was transferred to Russia. And I know that this is Ukraine's legal position, right? That this was wrong and unlawful. Tell me, please, when did Ukraine first voice this position, and what is the UN's response to it?
Right. It's a very long conversation. So I would try to give you a concise version of it. But the story is that it's not the first time that people raise questions, including legal questions. How come Russia sits in the Soviet seat? It would be totally untrue to say that it was just Ambassador Kyslytsia who, after his arrival to New York, started to raise this issue. It is another thing, however, that in the course of the last 2 years, it is Ukraine that became very vocal and very persistent about the need to revisit that very complicated both political and legal issue. And the fact that Russia sits for more than 30 years in that seat does not change the legal factors and framework that existed in December 1991. The dissolution of the Soviet Union had become imminent by the end of the summer 1991. Although the Soviet Union ceased to exist legally around the Christmas time in December 1991, the legal experts in many capitals and in the secretariat became very busy with advising the issue, what is going to happen to the Soviet seat in the UN in general and in the Security Council in particular. So the legal counsel of the secretariat, he prepared a number of memoranda to the Secretary General, starting from the summer until December, where he explained to the Secretary General what, in his legal opinion, are the consequences and difficulties that may arise from the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So, in one of his last memorandums addressed to the Secretary General of December 1991, he once again recalled that, in his legal opinion, there were 3 possible scenarios of how and what may happen to the Soviet seat, including the Security Council. But the most important thing was that the all three options would require both a vote in the Security Council and a vote in the General Assembly. Because as the Charter of the UN prescribes, members are admitted on the positive recommendation by the Security Council, followed by a vote in the General Assembly. You would not find not a single trace of any vote, neither in the Security Council nor in the General Assembly, on the issue of transferring the powers of a permanent member or admitting Russian Federation as a member state. And there are no other legal documents that offer you means or ways how to assume responsibilities of a permanent member in the Security Council other than they still exist in the UN Charter, right? There are no General Assembly resolutions. There are no resolutions of the Security Council that would say you can be acknowledged as a permanent member by virtue of a letter of your president. So basically what happened, President Yeltsin sent a letter to the United Nations, and he said in his letter, let me inform you of a wish of the Russian Federation to be a continuator, to continue the membership of the Soviet Union, both in the United Nations and in the Security Council. And the then ambassador Vorontsov, Yuli Vorontsov, who by irony was the president of the Security Council in the month of December 1991, he closing one of the meetings of the Security Council as the Soviet ambassador, he says, and by the way, there is this letter of Yeltsin where he says that Russian Federation wishes to be a continuator of the Soviet Union. He closes the meeting. Around the Christmas time, he goes to the Secretary General. He presents his credentials as ambassador of the Russian Federation. And he opens the first meeting after Christmas as the Russian ambassador. So it was like coup d'etat, you know. He closes one meeting as the Soviet ambassador, and after the Christmas time, he opens the meeting as the Russian ambassador. Not a single discussion, open discussion in the Security Council, not a single instance of vote. The members of the General Assembly, in my opinion, were robbed of their right to express themselves whether they agree. And I tell you, I believe that should the vote take place, Russia would be admitted legally. I'm sure that the General Assembly would vote for the Russian membership. I'm sure that, believe it or not, that even the Ukrainian delegation would vote for that, because as we mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, who were in power in Ukraine and at that moment, no prejudice neither to President Kravchuk nor to other high-ranking officials, but it is a matter of fact that they discussed this issue in Belovezhskaya Pushcha, they discussed this issue in Almaty, but nevertheless, Moscow decided not to go for a full vote, not to go with the legal procedures. And they did it on purpose. They did it on purpose because then the setting a precedent that Russia was a new entity, that Russia acquires rights through the process of agreement of other countries, would set a precedent that would have a very powerful consequences, like a domino effect on other issues, to begin with the property of the Soviet Union abroad, to begin with the assets of the Soviet Union in foreign banks, to continue with many, many other aspects. So they did it on purpose. So it was a very informed decision to bypass the legal requirements. And basically, the decision was taken behind the closed doors by the then permanent members, other permanent members of the Security Council. And that's it. So now we say very often in the meetings of the Security Council, oh, Russia violates all possible provisions of the Charter. But let me remind all of us, including Ukraine and Ukrainians, that we were all complacent and we all allowed Russia to assume responsibilities of the Soviet Union in the Security Council in the most illegal way possible. And the rest of the 3 decades of the presence of the Russian Federation in the Security Council and in UN in general have been a sequence of violations of the Charter that was brutally violated in December 1991. So we shouldn't really be surprised that we, from the very first instance of presence of the Russian Federation in UN, we let them believe that the most egregious violations of the Charter would not be punished.
Tell me, Mr. Ambassador, you were talking about Security Council, right? Which I heard you dub it Insecurity Council. I thought it was quite funny. And my question is that everyone's talking and everyone's buzzing about the need to reform it. And it's nothing new. It's been like, these discussions have been around for a while, but now they're kind of targeted and directed at Russia. Like, how do we suspend this membership, maybe kick it out altogether? And you were talking about basically the fact that, well, it doesn't have that seat, right? Because according to all that violation in the past, isn't that one of the ways to sort of make the reform feasible, which seems to be very difficult?
Well, I tell you, after this long answer to the question about the legality of the Russian presence in the Security Council, it is still the matter of fact that even the most close allies of Ukraine are not ready yet to deny, or rather, let me formulate that differently, to accept the fact that the Russian Federation acquired the seat illegally. They are already ready to admit, and they do very often, that the behavior of the Russian Federation, including in the Security Council, is unacceptable. And that's very important. I noticed, and many of us noticed here in New York, a very clear position of the US delegation beginning from probably August, or if not earlier. If you look at the speech of my very good friend, American Ambassador Linda, in San Francisco, that she delivered to one of the universities, and then her comments both on social networks and on the website of the mission about the need to reform the Security Council in response to what's going on in the Security Council. And that's a very important, if not game changer, then it's a very important turn on the road towards the reforming of the Security Council. The way the UN is organized and designed immobilizes any changes whatsoever unless the permanent members agree to those changes. Because if you open Article 108, you will see that amendments can be adopted by 2/3 of members of the United Nations, including all permanent members of the Security Council. So any meaningful change to the Charter is impossible, or not even meaningful, any change to the Charter is impossible unless all permanent members of the Security Council agree to it, So we can try to change rules of procedure, we can try to change methods of work, but we will not change the Charter unless all permanent members agree to the change. And that is that is where the most important question is. Will we reach a point in time when 4 permanent members, the United States, the UK, France, and China, will say, we will not count the Russian vote for the purposes of the change of the Charter? One may say, oh, that's illegal. I mean, we have to follow the Charter. We have signed the Charter in San Francisco. We ratified the Charter. charter is our Bible. But what the hell, my answer will be, and I bring you back to what we just discussed about December 1991, where you could not care less about the charter when you brought in the Russian Federation in violation of the charter. So I think that if this war, this aggression, does not bring about the meaningful change of the architecture of the Security Council and of how the Security Council deals with military aggressions, that will mean basically the end of the Security Council and its reputation. And that will be very much unfortunate. But once again, as I said, it would not, in my opinion, mean that we should turn our back on the world, because that's how the world is. Because if we leave the United Nations and we say, no, we don't like it, we will be probably the only country in the world that would turn its back to it.
I would say, I just want to point out two things: that apparently the charter leads to a catch-22 situation. So that's a bit weird in the sense that this is how it was developed. And also, probably where there is a will, there is always a way. So yes. Joking aside, Russia's bold behavior in the UN and the dissemination of all sorts of lies, including Lavrov's recent outrageous speech where he dubbed Ukraine a totalitarian state of Nazi kind, makes it look like the UN really lacks the determination to stop and say no. It's as if it allows Goebbels to come onto the stage and say something along the lines of Germany liberating Jews in concentration camps. Does the UN apparatus, the bureaucrats, let's put it that way, understand that? If so, what are they doing to address the problem? Perhaps, I don't know, find a way of dealing with this?
Well, first of all, let us not blow out of proportion the role and the powers of the Secretariat of the United Nations, including the Secretary General himself. Let me remind you that the United Nations was conceived by three old gentlemen, including one Secretary General, Stalin. And it's not a joke. He would not allow any other Secretary Generals who would be even comparable to him. That is why out of many, more than 100 articles of the UN Charter, there are only 5 articles dedicated to the Secretary General. And out of the 5 articles dedicated to the Secretary General, there are even less articles about his powers. So basically, the Secretary General is a secretary more than he's a general. And the only Secretary General who was very powerful in terms of his open confrontation with the Soviet Union and with the position of Moscow was Dag Hammarskjöld. And let us not forget how he ended up dying in an aircraft catastrophe that is still not fully investigated. I'm not saying that he was killed. I'm just reminding the facts of history. So after him, practically all Secretary Generals were very quiet and more efficient, less efficient. I mean, Kofi Annan was very successful in terms of delivering on his mandate. But it is also the matter of fact that not only in the Charter, but also in the policies of permanent members of the Security Council, they would never allow any Secretary General to play a meaningful role, rather than a role in implementing the decisions of the Security Council and of the General Assembly. That's one thing. Another thing is the Secretariat is not there to tell the member states what to do. The Secretariat is there to provide expertise and to implement the decisions of the governments. And as rightly said by President Zelensky last year, when he was in person addressing the General Assembly, you can pull out his speech of 2021, where he says, we all criticize, and rightly so. I do not quote, I just recall us of his speech. We all often criticize the United Nations, and rightly so. But let me remind you that the United Nations, the secretariat, is not a building. It is the gathering of member states. So when we criticize the United Nations, we criticize the governments that compose the United Nations. Therefore, that's on grand scale. On not a grand scale, but on practical, at a practical level, yes, the Secretariat of the United Nations is dozens of thousands of employees hired by member states to work for member states. But you would see even inconsistency of position among the deputies of Guterres, his assistant secretary generals. I mean, some of them are not even diligent enough to follow the lines on the aggression rather, of the Secretary General himself. They allow themselves to give their own versions or their own vision of what's going on, and we try to fight with that. We try to remind the members of the Secretariat that, first of all, they're hired by us, and secondly, that they must follow what the General Assembly has decided, including on aggression, and what their boss, the Secretary General, has already said on many occasions about the war.
How come they behave like that, do you think?
Well, there are many reasons. Some of them lost touch with reality. Some of them are useful, I would not use the second word. Some of them infiltrated by our opponents and enemies. I wouldn't be surprised that among thousands of Russian citizens who are employees of the UN, there is a good dozen of clear spies. But I would not say that those are only the Russian citizens. There are many other countries that have their citizens as part of the Secretariat. No, but I also hate conspiracy theories. I think that it is the duty of the leadership of the Secretariat to ensure and enforce that the Secretariat follows the decisions of member states, including those adopted by the General Assembly.
I see. One final question, I think, and that is, Mr. Ambassador, NATO is said to be discussing its response to a potential Russian nuclear strike, the likelihood of which has grown in the past weeks, unfortunately, and they are said to be discussing that on a daily basis. What is the UN doing in that respect, perhaps like even in the not so public area, outside, the typical, sorry to say, grave concern issuance type of action?
Well, let me, availing of the previous question, tell you that once again that the UN is not the staff members of the Secretariat. The UN are the member states and their governments.
But okay, but what
the UN was trying to, the member states of the UN were trying to achieve and approve a meaningful decision, for example, not long ago, a couple of weeks ago, during the review conference on the Treaty of Non-Proliferation, including the nuclear aspects and nuclear dangers emanating from the Russian presence in the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. It was the Russian Federation blocked the decision because they didn't like the language. So the nuclear threats are discussed in the Security Council, where, as we know, the Russian Federation is allowed to use the Soviet right to veto, and the nuclear threats are now discussed in the committees of the General Assembly that have opened their work after the high-level week of debates. So basically, the answer to your question is not what the UN will say, what the member states will be able to generate at the common position in New York, in the United Nations. And coming back to the picture of the General Assembly as it is, let me remind you that the collective democratic world it has strong presence there, but this strong presence is only about 85, 90 votes. Because if you look at the record of the General Assembly, the record of the votes on the suggestions of the collective democratic world, those votes are around 85, 90 votes, unless it is consensus.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for this interview.